In April of 1852, in the small river town of Stillwater Bend, Pennsylvania, workmen dredging the Allegheny River's shallow western channel made a discovery that would haunt the region for generations. Tangled in their equipment, buried in 17 years of river silt, they found the skeletal remains of 11 children, each bound in rotting cloth, each with stones sewn into the fabric that had dragged them to the riverbed. The children ranged in age from newborn to approximately 12 years old, according to the county physician's report. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was not merely the number of victims, but the methodical nature of their disposal. Each body had been wrapped in identical fashion, a deteriorating pattern of swaddling that suggested the same hands had prepared every single bundle. The stones used were river rocks of similar size and weight, carefully selected to ensure the packages would sink but not drift with the current. Within 3 days, authorities discovered something that transformed a horrifying mystery into an incomprehensible nightmare. The eldest victim, identified by a corroded locket still clutching a fragment of hair, was Margaret Winslow, aged 11 years and 7 months. She had been reported missing in the summer of 1835. Her mother, Clara Winslow, had claimed the girl had wandered off during a church picnic and drowned in the river despite extensive search efforts. The township mourned with the widow. Over the following week, as the county coroner attempted to identify the remains, a pattern emerged that defied rational explanation. Of the 11 children pulled from the river, at least 7 could be tentatively identified through fragmentary records, corroded jewelry, and deteriorating fabric patterns. All 7 had lived at various times in the household of Clara Winslow, either as her natural-born children, stepchildren from her 3 successive marriages, or wards placed in her care by the county poorhouse. The records of these deaths, disappearances, and unexplained absences had been scattered across 17 years, 3 different county record keepers, and 2 parish registries. No one had noticed the pattern. No one had thought to question why grief seemed to follow Clara Winslow like a shadow, why children in her care vanished with such troubling regularity. By the time authorities went to arrest Clara Winslow, she had been a respected resident of Stillwater Bend for 19 years. She had buried 3 husbands, raised funds for the church restoration, and was known throughout the township as a godly woman who had endured more than her share of tragedy. The constable who placed her in irons had attended the funeral service for one of her drowned children 8 years prior. The documents related to her trial were sealed by court order in 1853 and remained locked in the Allegheny County archives for exactly 100 years. The official reason given was to protect the dignity of the surviving family members. The unofficial reason, whispered among those who had read the trial transcripts, was far more disturbing. Some truths, they said, should stay buried with the river mud. But one question haunted everyone who learned the details of the case. If 11 children were found in that single stretch of river, how many more had washed downstream, scattered across 17 years of current and flood, never to be discovered at all? Before we continue with Clara Winslow's dark history, if this story intrigues you, or perhaps disturbs you in ways you can't quite articulate, I need you to do something right now. This channel exists to bring you the historical cases that were deliberately hidden, the stories that authorities decided were too troubling for public consumption. But YouTube's algorithm doesn't favor dark truths. It favors safe content, comfortable narratives, stories that don't disturb sleep or challenge assumptions about human nature. So if you believe these stories deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button now. And more importantly, click the notification bell. Choose all notifications, not just occasional updates. These videos get suppressed, shadow banned, and sometimes removed entirely. The only way this content reaches you is if you tell the algorithm that you want to see it, that you're willing to look at history's darkest corners without flinching. Here's my question for the community, and I want you to answer in the comments. What state or city are you watching from? I ask because stories like Clara Winslow's happened everywhere, in small towns and growing cities in your state, possibly in your county. The locations change, but the patterns remain. When you comment, you're not just engaging with this channel. You're mapping the hidden geography of America's buried horrors. This content isn't for everyone. It's only for the bravest among you, the true mystery seekers who understand that the past isn't a comfortable story with clear heroes and villains. It's messy, it's often evil, and it's always more complex than we want to believe. Now, let's go back to Stillwater Bend, Pennsylvania, in the years before anyone knew what Clara Winslow truly was. Stillwater Bend in 1833, when Clara Winslow first arrived, was not the kind of place where darkness was expected to flourish. The town sat along a fortunate curve of the Allegheny River, approximately 43 miles north of Pittsburgh, positioned where the current slowed just enough to make steamboat docking practical but maintained sufficient depth for year-round navigation. This geographical blessing had transformed what had been a frontier trading post into a legitimate township of roughly 800 souls by the early 1830s. The town's economy centered on three pillars. The river traffic itself, the lumber mills that processed timber floated down from the northern forests, and the modest agricultural output from the surrounding farmland. It was a working town, neither wealthy nor destitute, the kind of place where most families could afford a modest home, regular meals, and perhaps a luxury or two if the harvest was good. The main commercial street stretched for 4 blocks along the river, boasting 2 dry goods stores, a pharmacist, a saddle maker, 3 taverns, a boarding house, and the offices of Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, who served as the town's only trained physician. The social structure of Stillwater Bend reflected its practical nature. Unlike the established cities of the East Coast with their rigid hierarchies and old money families, or the wild boom towns of the expanding frontier with their lawless fluidity, Stillwater Bend occupied a middle space. Respectability mattered, but it could be earned. Church attendance was expected, but denominations competed for congregants rather than one dominated by tradition. The town had a constable, Jacob Mercer, who also ran a successful cooperage business. The justice of the peace, Hiram Goodwin, operated the larger of the 2 dry goods establishments. This blending of civic authority with commercial enterprise would later prove significant in understanding how Clara Winslow operated undetected for so long. In Stillwater Bend, the people responsible for noticing wrongdoing were the same people who relied on social cohesion for their business interests. Accusations disrupted commerce. Suspicions created factions. And in a town of 800 people, where everyone's reputation was currency, challenging a respectable widow's story meant risking your own standing in the community. Clara arrived in late September of 1833, traveling upriver from Pittsburgh as the new bride of Thomas Winslow, a widower of 41 years who owned a modest but productive grain mill on the southern edge of town. She was 26 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair she wore in the severe style favored by Methodist women, and a demeanor that was described in contemporary letters as serious and pious. She brought with her a daughter from a previous marriage, Margaret, then aged 3, and a reputation for godliness that Thomas Winslow's family found reassuring. Thomas's first wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, along with the infant. He had a son from that marriage, Robert, aged 7, who needed a mother's care. The marriage was practical, as most were in that time and place, but by all accounts it was not unhappy. Clara ran the household efficiently, kept a clean home, attended the Methodist Episcopal Church faithfully every Sunday, and seemed to dote on both children. The town's record-keeping in this era was fragmented by design and by accident. The county seat was in Kittanning, a day's ride away, and official records were often months behind actual events. Births and deaths were recorded by 3 separate authorities: the county clerk, the township register, and the individual churches. These records are rarely cross-referenced, and in an age before standardized filing systems, a death recorded in one place might never appear in another. This administrative chaos was compounded by the mobility of the era. Families moved frequently, following work or fleeing debt. Children were commonly sent to live with relatives during hard times or apprenticed out as young as 7 or 8 years old. The county poorhouse in Kittanning regularly placed orphans and foundlings, with families willing to take them in exchange for their labor. A child present in a household 1 year and gone the next raised no automatic suspicions. People assumed relocation, apprenticeship, or return to family members. Perhaps most significantly, child mortality in the 1830s and 1840s was devastatingly common. Of every 5 children born, 2 could be expected to die before reaching adulthood. Scarlet fever, consumption, diphtheria, drowning, farm accidents, infected wounds, death was a constant presence in family life. A household that experienced the loss of children was not unusual. It was expected. It was, in the worldview of the time, God's will. Clara Winslow understood this world perfectly. She understood that grief was common enough to be unremarkable, that record-keeping was chaotic enough to hide patterns, and that a woman who appeared devout and long-suffering would receive sympathy rather than suspicion. She understood that in a town where the doctor was also a church deacon, where the constable's wife organized charity drives, where business and civic duty were inseparably tangled, maintaining a respectable facade was more valuable than any lock or chain. Within 6 months of her arrival, Clara had established herself as a woman of standing in the community. She joined the Ladies' Church Aid Society. She was known to take in sewing work to supplement the household income, demonstrating both skill and industriousness. When a fire destroyed the home of a family with 3 young children, Clara was among the first to offer assistance, taking the youngest child, a girl of 5, into her home for 2 months while the family rebuilt. The child was returned healthy and well cared for. Clara's reputation as a charitable woman was cemented. By the summer of 1835, Clara Winslow was precisely what Stillwater Bend expected a respectable widow to be. Thomas Winslow had died that spring of what Dr. Harrow termed inflammation of the lungs, likely pneumonia, leaving Clara with the 2 children, a modest inheritance, and the community's profound sympathy. The mill was sold to pay outstanding debts, and Clara took a small house on River Street, supporting herself through sewing, laundry work, and occasional assistance from the church charity fund. No one thought it strange that she survived her husband. Women outlived men frequently in that era. No one questioned her needs. Widows with children were among the most sympathetic figures in the community. And when tragedy struck her family that summer, when young Margaret disappeared during the church picnic and was presumed drowned, the entire town mourned with the widow who had already endured so much loss. They held a memorial service without a body. Reverend Samuel Pitch delivered a sermon about God's mysterious ways. Clara wept quietly in the front pew, her stepson Robert beside her, her hand clutching a handkerchief that several women remembered as being embroidered with small blue flowers. The river had taken another child, people said. It was a dangerous river, especially during the summer when the current ran swift and cold with mountain runoff. Parents held their own children a little closer. And life in Stillwater Bend continued, as it always did, the current of daily existence flowing steadily forward, carrying away memory, obscuring the depths beneath its surface. Beneath that surface, wrapped in cloth with stones sewn carefully into the fabric, Margaret Winslow settled into the river mud. She would wait there for 17 years before the dredging equipment found her, and by then, she would not be alone. Clara Winslow's public persona in the years following Margaret's disappearance was that of the suffering saint, a woman tested repeatedly by divine providence, yet maintaining her faith through unimaginable loss. It was a role she performed with such conviction that even those who later read the trial transcripts found themselves momentarily sympathetic before remembering what she truly was. The key to understanding her deception lies in recognizing that she didn't avoid attention. She invited it. She positioned herself at the very center of the community's charitable and religious life, understanding that visibility, when properly managed, provides better cover than shadows ever could. In November of 1836, Clara married her second husband, William Fletcher, a rope maker whose first wife had died the previous winter. Fletcher was 34, a solid craftsman with steady income and no children of his own. He was also, according to letters written by his sister, a simple man who wanted only a Christian home and a good woman's guidance. In Clara, he believed he had found both. The marriage brought Clara financial stability and something more valuable, renewed respectability. She was no longer the tragic widow living on charity, but a married woman managing a household. Fletcher's business required him to travel monthly to Pittsburgh to purchase hemp and deliver finished rope to river boat operations. These trips typically lasted 4 to 6 days. During his absences, Clara managed the home with what neighbors described as exceptional capability. It was during one of these absences, in March of 1837, that Clara took in her first ward from the county poorhouse. The child was a boy named Thomas Garrett, aged approximately 8 years. The poorhouse records were uncertain of his exact birth date. He had been orphaned when both parents succumbed to cholera during the 1833 epidemic. According to the placement documents, signed by County Overseer Martin Ashford, Clara Winslow Fletcher was selected as a foster parent due to her demonstrated Christian character and experience in child-rearing. Thomas Garrett lived in Clara's household for 11 months. Neighbors occasionally saw him hauling water, splitting kindling, or running errands for Mrs. Fletcher. The boy appeared adequately fed and clothed, if somewhat quiet. In February of 1838, Clara reported to the county that Thomas had run away during the night, possibly attempting to return to Pittsburgh, where he had vague memories of relatives. She had discovered his absence in the morning and immediately informed Constable Mercer. A perfunctory search was conducted. No trace of the boy was found. The county records noted him as absconded, and the case was closed. Clara expressed appropriate distress over her failure to provide adequate supervision. The Ladies' Church Aid Society consoled her, noting that orphan boys were often troubled and ungrateful, prone to wandering. In the river mud, Thomas Garrett's small skeleton would eventually be identified by the remnants of the poorhouse-issued wool shirt he was wearing when he died. But in 1838, no one suspected. Instead, Clara's reputation as a charitable woman willing to take in difficult cases was enhanced. When she applied to take another ward the following year, the county approved without hesitation. William Fletcher died in August of 1839. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, who attended him in his final illness, recorded the cause of death as putrid fever, likely typhoid. Fletcher's symptoms had included severe digestive distress, fever, and delirium. He had been ill for 6 days before succumbing. Clara had nursed him throughout, barely sleeping, preparing special broths and administering the medications Dr. Harrow prescribed. The doctor personally witnessed her devotion and commented on it to several members of the community. At the funeral, Clara's grief appeared genuine and profound. She had lost 2 husbands in 4 years. She was 32 years old and twice widowed. The community's sympathy was overwhelming. What the community didn't know, what wouldn't be discovered until the trial, was that among Clara's possessions, hidden in a false bottom of her sewing basket, was a small collection of botanical preparations including concentrated extracts of water hemlock and white snakeroot, both of which produce symptoms nearly identical to typhoid fever when administered in carefully calibrated doses over several days. But in 1839, such knowledge would have seemed absurd. Clara Winslow was a godly woman, not a poisoner. She was a victim of circumstance, not an architect of death. Fletcher's estate was modest but sufficient. Clara inherited the rope-making business, which she sold for a reasonable sum, and his house on River Street. She also retained custody of her stepson Robert, now 11 years old, and a new ward from the county, a girl named Sarah Pitts, aged 6, whose mother had died giving birth to her and whose father had abandoned her at the poorhouse steps. Robert Winslow would survive his stepmother, though he would carry scars that weren't visible to the eye. Sarah Pitts would not be so fortunate. Between 1839 and 1843, Clara took in 4 more children from the county poorhouse. The overseer, Martin Ashford, considered her one of his most reliable placements. She never asked for additional compensation beyond the standard quarterly stipend of $3 per child. She attended church faithfully, maintained a clean home, and the children in her care appeared adequately supervised when seen in public. What Ashford didn't track, what no one thought to track, was how long each child remained in her care. The poorhouse records noted placements but rarely followed up on outcomes. If a child was no longer in a household, the assumption was that they had been apprenticed out, sent to relatives, or in some cases, had died of the usual childhood diseases. Ashford's records were chaotic at best, maintained in ledgers that were irregularly updated and cross-referenced with nothing. Of the 4 children placed with Clara during this period, 3 would eventually be identified among the river remains. The 4th, a boy named Jacob, simply vanished from all records entirely. He was placed with Clara in October of 1841 and never mentioned again in any surviving document. Dr. Harrow, who would later testify at the trial, remembered treating children in Clara's household on at least 6 occasions between 1837 and 1850. He recalled a boy with a persistent cough, a girl with scarlet fever who recovered, another child with worms, the usual ailments. What he didn't notice, because he had no reason to notice, was that several of the children he was called to examine simply stopped existing. He assumed they had moved on to other placements, or returned to relatives, or any of a dozen ordinary explanations. When specifically asked during the trial if he had ever suspected Clara of wrongdoing, Dr. Harrow's testimony was painfully honest. She was the last person in Stillwater Bend I would have suspected of anything more criminal than perhaps excessive piety. She presented as a woman whom life had treated harshly, but who maintained her Christian virtue through adversity. I considered her a model of fortitude. Constable Jacob Mercer's relationship with Clara was similarly unsuspicious. He purchased household goods from her occasionally. She sold preserves and did fine sewing work that his wife favored. When Clara reported children as runaways, or when she sought his assistance with minor household matters, he responded as he would for any respectable widow. He had no investigative training beyond common sense, and no reason to apply even that to a woman who attended church more regularly than he did. Perhaps most tragically, Reverend Samuel Pitched of the Methodist Episcopal Church became Clara's most effective enabler, though entirely without knowledge. From the pulpit, he regularly praised Clara's faith in the face of suffering. He cited her as an example of Christian forbearance when delivering sermons about accepting God's will. When Clara lost children to drowning or fever or accident, he provided spiritual comfort and public validation of her grief. In his journal, portions of which were read during the trial, Reverend Pitcht wrote in 1843, "Sister Clara has endured losses that would break a lesser faith. That she continues in devotion and service is a testament to the sustaining power of Christ's love. I pray that the Lord will grant her peace after so much suffering." The Reverend's endorsement provided Clara with social capital that was nearly unassailable. To question her was to question his judgment. To suspect her was to suspect his discernment. In a community where the minister's opinion shaped social standing, Clara had positioned herself as beyond reproach. Her third marriage in June of 1844 was to a widower named Henry Calloway, a man of 52 who operated a small freight business transporting goods between river towns. Calloway was gone for extended periods, sometimes 2 weeks at a time. He had a daughter from his first marriage, Elizabeth, aged 9, who came to live in Clara's household. Elizabeth Calloway would be one of the 11 bodies pulled from the river in 1852. The locket that identified her contained a small painting of her mother, who had died when Elizabeth was 4 years old. But in 1844, the marriage seemed unremarkable. Another widower, another widow, both seeking companionship and practical partnership. The community approved. The Reverend blessed the union. And Clara's household continued as it had before, children coming and going, some faces becoming familiar in town for a few months before disappearing, their absences explained by ordinary circumstances that no one thought to question too closely. The surface was so carefully maintained, the deception so thoroughly woven into the fabric of ordinary life, that even when cracks began to appear, they were plastered over with assumptions about bad luck, divine testing, and the unfortunate realities of child mortality in the mid-19th century. It would take years, and the undeniable physical evidence dredged from the river mud, before anyone would truly see past the facade Clara had constructed. And even then, some would struggle to reconcile the respectable widow they had known with the methodical killer the evidence revealed. The first crack in Clara Winslow's carefully constructed facade appeared in the autumn of 1847, though no one recognized it as such at the time. A woman named Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard, wife of a lumber mill foreman, happened to be walking along the river path at dusk when she observed something that troubled her enough to mention it to her husband, though not to authorities. She saw Clara Winslow at the water's edge, approximately a quarter-mile downstream from the main boat landing, in an area where the bank was steep and the current ran swiftly. Clara was alone, which itself was unusual. Respectable women rarely walked the river paths unaccompanied, especially at dusk. She was carrying what appeared to be a bundle of laundry or fabric, something wrapped and tied. Mrs. Pritchard, who was some distance away and watching from an elevated position on the path, observed Clara standing at the water's edge for several minutes, looking up and down the river as if checking for observers. Then Clara tossed the bundle into the water. It sank immediately, without floating or drifting as ordinary cloth would. Mrs. Pritchard assumed it must have been weighted with stones, perhaps ruined fabric being disposed of along with ballast from the household. It struck her as odd. Most people burned ruined cloth or used it for rags, but not necessarily suspicious. When she mentioned it to her husband, he suggested that perhaps Clara was disposing of items contaminated by illness, which would explain both the weighting and the secrecy. Disease-touched materials were sometimes sunk in the river rather than burned, to avoid spreading contagion through smoke. The explanation satisfied Mrs. Pritchard's concern, and she thought no more of it. She would remember this incident with horror 5 years later, when she testified at the trial and learned that in the week prior to her observation, a 6-year-old ward in Clara's care had been reported as having wandered away from the house and presumably drowned. The second incident occurred in February of 1849 and involved a man named Samuel Ricketts, who worked as a laborer on the river docks. Ricketts was returning from one of the riverside taverns late at night. He admitted to having consumed several whiskeys when he witnessed something that sobered him instantly. He saw Clara Winslow's husband, Henry Calloway, loading something into a small rowboat at one of the private docks. The object being loaded was approximately the size of a child, wrapped in dark fabric. Calloway was struggling with the weight and awkwardness of the bundle. As Ricketts watched from the shadow of a warehouse, Calloway rowed out into the river channel, perhaps 50 yards from shore. There in the moonlight, Ricketts saw Calloway lift the bundle and drop it over the side of the boat. The splash was audible even from the shore. The bundle sank without resurfacing. Calloway sat in the boat for several minutes, as if waiting to ensure it wouldn't rise again, then rowed back to shore. Ricketts, frightened by what he had witnessed and uncertain what it meant, retreated without confronting Calloway. The next day, wrestling with what to do, he confided in the tavern keeper, a man named Douglas Perry. Perry's response was practical rather than alarmed. The Calloways had recently lost a child to winter fever. Everyone knew that. The Winslow woman had nursed the poor thing for days. Most likely Calloway had been disposing of contaminated bedding or perhaps even, and Perry lowered his voice here, the body itself, if the family was too poor to afford a proper burial. It was shameful, perhaps, but not criminal. Pauper burials in the river were not unheard of, though certainly not discussed in polite society. Ricketts, unsure of what he'd actually seen and unwilling to accuse a respectable man of wrongdoing based on a nighttime observation while admittedly drunk, allowed himself to be convinced. He never reported what he saw to Constable Mercer. When called to testify at the trial 3 years later, he wept openly on the witness stand, convinced that his silence had enabled Clara to kill again. The third incident was not a single observation, but a slowly dawning recognition by Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, and it began with a conversation in his office in the spring of 1850. A merchant named Isaiah Thomas had come to consult the doctor about a recurring stomach ailment. During the appointment, Thomas mentioned that he'd recently seen Clara Winslow purchasing white hellebore root from the pharmacist, a substantial quantity. Thomas knew this because he'd been in the pharmacy at the time, and had overheard Clara explaining to the pharmacist that she had a severe problem with rats in her cellar and garden. Dr. Harrow, who had considerable knowledge of botanical poisons from his medical training, felt a small flutter of unease. White hellebore was indeed used as a rodent poison, but it was also highly toxic to humans and required careful handling. Moreover, it was not the most common or effective rodenticide. Arsenic, which the pharmacist certainly stocked, was cheaper and more reliable for pest control. The observation lodged in Harrow's mind like a small splinter. Over the following weeks, he found himself thinking about Clara Winslow more carefully than he ever had before. He began reviewing his records of visits to her household over the years. What he found was a pattern he had never noticed because he had been looking at individual incidents rather than the aggregate. Clara Winslow had, over the course of 16 years, lost an extraordinary number of children in her care. Harrow counted at least 9 children who had been present in her household at various times and subsequently disappeared from the community. Some he had been told had drowned. Others had died of fever while he was away on calls to other townships and had been buried before his return. Still others had simply vanished from his awareness. He would treat a child once or twice, then never see that child again. Individually, each case had seemed unremarkable. Children did drown, children did die of fever. Children were frequently moved between households, sent to relatives, or apprenticed out. But when Harrow tallied them together, the number seemed statistically improbable. He confided his concern to his wife, Martha, who listened carefully and then offered a perspective that simultaneously reassured and disturbed him. Clara, she pointed out, specifically took in children from the poorhouse, the most vulnerable, often sickly, poorly nurtured children. It was hardly surprising that such children had higher mortality rates. Moreover, Clara herself had suffered tragedy. Perhaps the Lord was testing her, or perhaps she was simply unlucky in the children assigned to her care. Dr. Harrow wanted to believe this explanation. He respected Clara. He had witnessed her nursing sick children with apparent devotion. He had no evidence of wrongdoing, only a statistical anomaly that could be explained by the demographics of the children in her care. But he could not entirely dismiss his unease. He began paying closer attention to Clara's household, making a mental note to examine carefully any children in her care if called upon to do so. He would never get that chance. By April of 1852, there were no children living in Clara Winslow's household. Henry Calloway had died the previous year. Dr. Harrow had attended him, noting symptoms consistent with acute gastric distress and organ failure, cause uncertain but possibly related to contaminated food or water. Clara was once again a widow, living alone in her house on River Street, supporting herself through sewing and laundry work, attended church faithfully, and was regarded by most of the community as a pitiable figure whose life had been marked by extraordinary suffering. Then came the discovery that transformed suspicion into certainty, theory into undeniable fact. On April 14, 1852, the Allegheny River Navigation Company contracted a crew of workmen to dredge the western channel near Stillwater Bend. The channel had been gradually silting up, making navigation difficult for the larger steamboats. The dredging equipment, a crane and bucket apparatus operated from a floating barge, had been working for 3 days without incident. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the dredge bucket brought up something that caught in the mechanism, jamming the works. The crew supervisor, a man named Patrick O'Sullivan, climbed down to investigate the jam. What he found tangled in the bucket's teeth was fabric, badly deteriorated, covered in river mud, but unmistakably cloth that had been woven and sewn by human hands. O'Sullivan pulled at the fabric, trying to free it. The cloth tore in his hands, and something pale and curved rolled out onto the barge deck. It took O'Sullivan several seconds to comprehend that he was looking at a human rib bone. The work stopped immediately. O'Sullivan, badly shaken, sent a runner to fetch Constable Mercer. By the time Mercer arrived, the crew had carefully extracted the rest of the bundle from the dredge mechanism. What lay on the deck was a partially intact human skeleton, small, clearly a child, still partially wrapped in the remnants of dark fabric. Tied into the fabric were river stones, each roughly the size of a man's fist. Constable Mercer, who had never investigated anything more serious than theft and the occasional assault, stared at the remains with a growing sense of horror. This was not an accidental drowning. This was not a child who had fallen into the river and tragically perished. This was a body that had been deliberately weighted and disposed of. He ordered the dredging crew to continue working, but now to carefully examine every bucket load for additional remains. By sunset, they had found 3 more bundles. By the end of the following day, the count had risen to 7. The work continued for a week, expanding the search area both upstream and downstream. The final count was 11 distinct sets of remains, all children, all wrapped in similar fashion, all weighted with stones. Dr. Harrow was called to examine the remains. He worked in a warehouse commandeered for the purpose, laying out the bones with as much care and dignity as possible. The deterioration was extensive. 17 years of river water had destroyed most soft tissue and degraded much of the fabric, but certain items had survived. Buttons in some cases, a corroded belt buckle from a boy's trousers, the locket that would identify Elizabeth Calloway, a small wooden cross on a cord, its surface worn smooth but still recognizable. As Harrow worked, his unease from 2 years earlier crystallized into a terrible certainty. He recognized some of these children, not their bones but the artifacts. A pattern of fabric that he remembered seeing on a child in Clara Winslow's household. A button style that he had noticed because his own daughters wore similar ones. When Constable Mercer asked if he had any thoughts on who these children might be, Dr. Harrow hesitated. To voice his suspicion was to accuse a respectable widow of the most heinous crimes imaginable. It was to admit that his own observations, his own vague concerns, might have prevented further deaths if he had acted on them. But the evidence demanded honesty. "I believe," Harrow said carefully, "that we should compare these remains against the records of children who have lived in Clara Winslow's household over the past 17 years. I believe we will find a correspondence." Mercer stared at him, the color draining from his face. "Clara Winslow, the widow on River Street, doctor, that's impossible. I've known that woman for 19 years. "I know," Harrow said quietly. "So have I, but look at these remains, Jacob. Look at the method of disposal. This is not the work of a stranger disposing of random victims. This is someone who had access to children, who could make them disappear without raising alarm, and who used the same technique repeatedly. How many children have passed through Clara Winslow's care over the years? How many have disappeared?" The constable had no answer. But over the following 3 days, working with county officials and church records, a pattern emerged that could not be explained away by coincidence or bad luck. Of the 11 bodies pulled from the river, 7 could be tentatively identified through comparison of artifacts and records. All 7 had lived in Clara Winslow's household. Of the remaining 4, 3 had been placed with foster families in the region, but records were too fragmentary to determine exact placements. The 11th remained entirely unidentified, a child perhaps 2 years old, with no artifacts and no corresponding records. On April 19, 1852, Constable Mercer walked to the house on River Street and arrested Clara Winslow for murder. She did not resist. She did not weep or protest her innocence. According to Mercer's later testimony, she simply looked at him with an expression he could not decipher, something between relief and contempt, and said, "I wondered how long the river would keep my secrets." If this is giving you chills, if you're sitting there feeling a creeping sense of dread about what we're going to uncover next, I need you to do something important. Pause for just a moment. Look at the like button below this video and click it. Not for the algorithm, though that helps. Do it as a marker, a way of telling yourself that you're willing to go deeper into this story, to see it through to its darkest revelations. Share this video. I know that sounds like a standard YouTube request, but think about why I'm asking. Stories like Clara Winslow's were sealed, buried, deliberately hidden from public knowledge for 100 years. There's a reason for that. Authorities decided that some truths were too disturbing, that communities needed to forget, that certain horrors should be erased from collective memory. But erasure doesn't prevent recurrence. It only ensures we don't recognize the patterns when they appear again. The people in Stillwater Bend in 1852 thought monsters were easy to identify, that evil announced itself, that wickedness was obvious. They learned too late that the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand respectability, who weaponize trust, who hide in plain sight behind piety and grief. So share this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because what the authorities found when they began investigating Clara Winslow's household, when they started pulling apart her carefully constructed facade, was worse than anyone had imagined. The 11 bodies in the river were not the full scope of her crimes. They were only what the river had preserved. The search of Clara Winslow's home began on April 20th, 1852, conducted by Constable Mercer, Dr. Harrow, Justice of the Peace Hiram Goodwin, and 3 deputized citizens. What they found in that modest house on River Street would haunt every man present for the remainder of his life. The front rooms appeared ordinary, a parlor with simple furniture, a kitchen with standard cooking implements, a sewing area with baskets of fabric and thread. Everything was clean, orderly, exactly what one would expect from a respectable widow's household. It was only when they began searching with deliberate thoroughness, looking not just at surfaces but into hidden spaces, that the horror revealed itself in layers. In the cellar behind several crates of preserves, they found a wooden chest secured with a simple lock. When forced open, it contained items that initially seemed innocuous: children's clothing, carefully folded and sorted by size. Small shoes worn but serviceable, a boy's cap, a girl's Sunday dress, perhaps a dozen garments in total. Dr. Harrow recognized one of the dresses immediately. He had seen it on Elizabeth Calloway, Clara's stepdaughter, just weeks before the girl had reportedly drowned in the summer of 1847. Clara had claimed the current had carried the body downstream, that despite days of searching, Elizabeth had never been recovered. The community had mourned. A memorial service had been held. The dress had not been carried downstream. It had been carefully laundered, folded, and stored in Clara's cellar. As they continued examining the chest's contents, they found more items that matched children who had disappeared from Clara's care. A small wooden horse, crudely carved, that Martin Ashford from the county poorhouse identified as belonging to Thomas Garrett. The boy Clara had reported as a runaway in 1838. A hair ribbon that matched the description in county records of items given to Sarah Pitts when she was placed in Clara's care in 1839. These were trophies, keepsakes. Evidence that Clara had not simply disposed of these children as one might discard unwanted burdens, but had kept pieces of them, had preserved mementos of her crimes. But the chest of clothing was only the beginning. In Clara's bedroom, inside a wardrobe that required the removal of a false back panel, they discovered a ledger. It was a standard account book, the kind merchants used to track transactions. But Clara's entries were not commercial records. The ledger contained names, dates, and notations spanning from 1835 to 1851. Each entry followed a similar format: Margaret Winslow, age 11 years, 7 months, August 12, 1835. River Stones 6 count, Deep Channel Evening, Thomas Garrett, age 8 years estimated, February 4, 1838. River Stones 5 count, Below Mill Night, Sarah Pitts, age 6 years. November 19, 1839. River Stones 6 count, Downstream Bend, Evening. The entries continued page after methodical page, 17 entries in total, 17 names. 17 children whose lives Clara had ended and whose bodies she had committed to the river. 17. The 11 bodies recovered from the dredging represented only what the river had preserved in that particular location. The current had scattered the others downstream, or the fabric had finally rotted through, allowing the bones to separate and drift, becoming indistinguishable from natural debris. Dr. Harrow, reading the ledger in the fading afternoon light of Clara's bedroom, felt his hands begin to shake. The clinical precision of the entries was somehow more disturbing than any passionate confession would have been. This was not the work of someone driven by ungovernable rage or temporary madness. This was systematic. This was accounting. The final entry was dated October 3, 1851, just 6 months before Clara's arrest. Daniel Morse, age 9 years, October 3, 1851, River Stones 7 count, Below Ferry Crossing Night, struggled. That final word, struggled, was the only variation in the otherwise formulaic entries. It suggested that Daniel Morse, unlike the others, had fought his death. That Clara had recorded this detail indicated either a compulsion for accuracy or something darker, a need to note the difference, to remember the ones who resisted. The ledger also contained a second section, located in the back pages and written in what appeared to be a different ink, possibly added at different times. These entries were not about the children. They were recipes, but not for food. For quiet sleep, white snake root dried and powdered, 3 grains in warm milk, effective within 1 hour, no struggle. For drowning, tincture of laudanum double measure, child insensible, river takes easily, appears natural. For lingering illness, water hemlock root prepared as tea, small doses daily. Symptoms appear as fever, doctor will not suspect. There were 11 such recipes, each describing methods of sedation, poisoning, or incapacitation. Several included notations about dosage relative to the child's size, adjustments for age, observations about effectiveness. Clara Winslow had not simply killed children. She had experimented. She had refined her methods. She had kept records as a physician might keep case notes, tracking what worked, what left evidence, what attracted suspicion. The discovery that shattered whatever composure the searchers had maintained came in the late afternoon, when one of the deputized citizens, a carpenter named John Wessex, noticed that several of the floorboards in the cellar appeared newer than the others. When pried up, they revealed a shallow space beneath, perhaps 18 inches deep, running the length of one wall. In that space, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were bundles of fabric identical to what had been found wrapped around the children's remains in the river. Dark wool cut into squares approximately 4 feet on each side. Each square had been hemmed to prevent fraying. Several had pockets sewn along the edges, pockets sized precisely to hold river stones. There were 8 prepared burial shrouds in that space. 8. Clara had been prepared to kill again. She had prefabricated the materials, had them ready and waiting for the next child who would be placed in her care, the next victim who would be quietly sedated, wrapped, weighted, and delivered to the river. The men stood in that cellar, staring at the evidence, and for a long moment no one spoke. Constable Mercer would later testify that he had to step outside to vomit. Justice Goodwin sat on the cellar stairs with his head in his hands. Dr. Harrow, perhaps trained by his medical experience to maintain composure in the face of horror, continued documenting what they had found, though his handwriting grew increasingly irregular as the list lengthened. Clara Winslow was being held in a locked room on the 2nd floor of the constable's office. Stillwater Bend had no proper jail. On April 21st, she was interviewed by Justice Goodwin, with Dr. Harrow and Constable Mercer present as witnesses. A court recorder named Simon Matthews took detailed notes, which survived as part of the sealed trial documents. When confronted with the ledger, Clara did not deny its authenticity. When asked if the entries represented children she had killed, she answered with a single word, yes. Her affect during the interview was described as unnaturally calm and absent of appropriate emotion. She answered questions directly but offered no explanations, no justifications, no expressions of remorse. It was as if she were discussing household accounts rather than the murder of 17 children. The interview transcript includes this exchange. Goodwin, Mrs. Winslow, why did you kill these children? Clara, because I could. Goodwin, that is not an answer, madam. What purpose did their death serve? Clara, must there be a purpose? You assign purpose to pestilence and flood, call it God's will, make meaning from meaninglessness. I required no purpose beyond the act itself. Harrow, did you feel no affection for these children, no maternal instinct? Clara, I felt what was necessary to feel in public. In private, I felt nothing. They were burdens made of flesh. The county paid $3 quarterly for their keep. I kept the money and disposed of the burden. Mercer, how did you choose which children to, which ones? Clara, the ones no one would miss, orphans. Foundlings, children with no family to ask questions. The county was grateful to place them. No one tracked them carefully. It was quite simple, really. This absence of remorse, this clinical discussion of child murder as a practical matter, disturbed the interviewers more than any passionate confession might have. Clara was not insane in any legal sense. She understood right from wrong, understood the consequences of her actions. She simply did not care. When asked about her husbands, Clara initially declined to answer. But after several minutes of silence, she offered this statement. Thomas died naturally. I had no hand in that. The others served their purpose and then became inconvenient. A widow receives more sympathy than a wife. Sympathy grants access and forestalls suspicion. The implication was clear. Clara had murdered at least 2 of her 3 husbands, William Fletcher and Henry Calloway. Possibly she had killed Thomas Winslow as well, though she never explicitly admitted to that. The methodology described in her ledger, slow poisoning that mimicked natural illness, aligned perfectly with the symptoms Dr. Harrow had observed in Fletcher and Calloway during their final illnesses. Clara Winslow had not simply killed 17 children over 17 years. She had murdered her way into positions of trust and authority, had weaponized widowhood to access vulnerable victims, and had turned the community's sympathy into camouflage for systematic predation. As word of the discovery spread through Stillwater Bend, the community's response evolved through stages of denial, horror, and eventually a kind of collective shame. Many people initially refused to believe it. Clara Winslow, the godly widow, impossible, there must be some mistake. But as the evidence became public knowledge, the ledger, the burial shrouds, the chest of children's clothing, denial became untenable. The horror was real. It had been happening for 17 years, hidden behind prayers and piety and the community's willingness to believe the best of someone who presented the right facade. Some of Clara's most vocal defenders became her most vehement accusers, as if the violence of their condemnation could erase their earlier trust. Reverend Pitcht, who had praised Clara from the pulpit, now declared her a servant of Satan and called for immediate execution. Women who had worked alongside Clara in the Ladies' Church Aid Society burned items she had touched, as if evil were contagious. But there were also people who withdrew into silence, burdened by the knowledge that they had seen things they hadn't reported, had noticed oddities they'd explained away, had allowed social pressure to override instinct. Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard, who had seen Clara throwing a weighted bundle into the river in 1847, became nearly catatonic with guilt. Dr. Harrow began drinking heavily, unable to forgive himself for not acting on his suspicions in 1850. Samuel Ricketts, the dock worker who had witnessed Henry Calloway disposing of what was almost certainly his stepdaughter's body, left Stillwater Bend and never returned. The county poorhouse overseer, Martin Ashford, resigned his position. He had placed at least 9 children in Clara's care, had praised her as a reliable foster parent, had never followed up adequately on their outcomes. While not criminally culpable, he was morally devastated by his role in enabling the murders. Perhaps the most tragic figure in the aftermath was Robert Winslow, Clara's stepson, now 24 years old and living in Pittsburgh. When informed of his stepmother's arrest and the evidence against her, he returned to Stillwater Bend to provide testimony. What he revealed added yet another layer to the horror. Robert testified that he had witnessed Clara kill his stepsister Margaret in August of 1835, when he was 7 years old. He had seen Clara give Margaret something to drink that made her sleepy. He had watched as Clara wrapped the unconscious girl in fabric and weighted it with stones. He had been present when Clara took the bundle to the river. And then Clara had explained to him, in simple terms a 7-year-old could understand, that if he ever told anyone what he had seen, she would do the same to him. That Margaret had been bad had needed to be punished, and that little boys who told tales would be punished too. For 17 years, Robert had carried that secret, terrorized into silence by a threat made when he was 7 years old. He had lived in Clara's household until he was old enough to apprentice out, had endured watching other children come and go, had known or suspected their fates, and had been too frightened to speak. He testified with tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking repeatedly. When asked why he hadn't come forward as an adult, when he was no longer under Clara's direct control, he had no adequate answer except this. She made me believe that no one would believe me, that I would be punished for lying about a godly woman, and I think I also wanted to believe that what I remembered was wrong, that it had been a nightmare, a child's confusion. It was easier to doubt my own memory than to accept what she was. Robert Winslow's testimony revealed that Clara's reign of terror had included psychological abuse and witness intimidation. She had not only killed with systematic precision, but had also ensured her safety through the manipulation and terrorizing of a child. The full scope of Clara's crimes would never be completely known. The 17 names in her ledger represented confirmed victims, but investigators believed there might be more. The ledger began in 1835 with Margaret Winslow, but Clara had married Thomas Winslow and arrived in Stillwater Bend in 1833. What had happened in those 2 years? Had there been victims before Margaret? Similarly, the 4 unidentified sets of remains from the river suggested additional victims whose names Clara had not recorded, or had recorded elsewhere in documents never found. Investigators searched for additional ledgers, additional hiding places, but found nothing. If there were other records, Clara had destroyed them or hidden them too well. When asked directly during a subsequent interview if there were more victims than the 17 listed in her ledger, Clara smiled, the first expression of emotion anyone had witnessed from her, and said, "The river knows." That answer, more than any other, captured the essence of Clara Winslow's evil. She had turned the Allegheny River into an accomplice, had used its currents and depths to conceal her crimes, had relied on its constancy to carry away evidence. For 17 years, the river had kept her secrets, had scattered bones and rotted fabric, had protected her through the simple natural process of flowing water. Only the accident of the dredging equipment, the random location chosen by the navigation company, the chance entanglement of a single bundle, only these circumstances beyond Clara's control had finally revealed what lay beneath the surface. How many other rivers held similar secrets? How many other respectable widows, pious community members, trusted caregivers had discovered the same method, the same exploitation of trust and administrative chaos? These questions haunted the investigators, but they had no answers. They had only Clara Winslow, her ledger, her burial shrouds, and the undeniable evidence of 17 murdered children. It would have to be enough. As the initial shock of Clara Winslow's arrest began to settle into grim acceptance, County Prosecutor Edmund Blackwell arrived from Kittanning to take charge of the investigation. Blackwell was 46 years old, a former Pittsburgh attorney with a reputation for thoroughness and an intolerance for political interference. He would need both qualities in the weeks ahead. Blackwell's first action was to expand the investigation beyond Stillwater Bend itself. Clara had not appeared fully formed in the town in 1833. She had come from somewhere, had a history, had lived a life before becoming Thomas Winslow's bride. If she had killed 17 children in Stillwater Bend, what had she done before arriving there? The task of tracing Clara's origins fell to a young attorney named Lawrence Kemper, who served as Blackwell's assistant. Working with church records, marriage licenses, and county archives, Kemper began the painstaking process of reconstructing Clara's life prior to 1833. What he discovered was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Clara had been born Clara Marsh in 1807 in a small village outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She was the fourth of 6 children born to a farming family of modest means. Her father, according to county records, had died in 1819 when Clara was 12 years old. The cause of death was listed as stomach ailment. In 1823, when Clara was 16, her mother remarried. The stepfather, a man named Joseph Kern, died less than a year later of what the local doctor described as severe dyspepsia and organ failure. Clara's mother died 6 months after that, the cause listed only as decline. At 17, Clara had been orphaned for the second time. She had gone to live with an aunt in Lancaster County, where she remained until 1827 when she married a farmer named William Marsh. They had one child, a daughter named Margaret, born in 1830. William Marsh died in 1832, the cause of death, putrid fever. The pattern was already visible, even in these early records. People around Clara died with suspicious frequency, usually of ailments that affected the digestive system or presented as acute fevers, symptoms consistent with poisoning. But in each case, the deaths had been accepted as natural. Fevers were common. Stomach ailments were ubiquitous. Doctors in rural areas had limited diagnostic capabilities and no reason to suspect foul play in a young woman's household. After William Marsh's death, Clara had moved to Pittsburgh, where she lived for approximately 1 year before meeting Thomas Winslow during one of his business trips to the city. They had married in August of 1833, and Clara had moved to Stillwater Bend that September. But Kemper's investigation revealed something else. During Clara's year in Pittsburgh, she had worked as a domestic servant in the household of Dr. Cornelius Blake, a physician who specialized in botanical medicine and toxicology. This detail was critical. Clara had not simply intuited how to poison people. She had worked in the household of a man who kept extensive libraries on medicinal plants, who prepared tinctures and extracts, who understood dosages and effects. She would have had access to his books, his supplies, possibly even his lecture notes if he taught students. Kemper traveled to Pittsburgh to interview Dr. Blake, who was now 71 years old and retired. Blake remembered Clara, though not fondly. She was competent, Blake told Kemper, but there was something peculiar about her. She asked too many questions about the poisonous plants, wanted to know specifics about lethal dosages and symptoms. I thought she was simply curious, perhaps interested in medical knowledge. I dismissed my unease as unfair prejudice. I believed women should be educated. I gave her books to read, allowing her to observe my preparations. God forgive me, I taught her the very knowledge she would use to murder. Blake's household records showed that Clara had been employed from October 1832 to August 1833. During that time, Blake had lost a substantial quantity of various botanical substances to what he had assumed was simple waste or misplacement. The missing items included white snakeroot, water hemlock, white hellebore, and concentrated laudanum. Clara had stolen the tools of her trade from her employer before moving to Stillwater Bend. She had arrived in that unsuspecting town already equipped with poisons and the knowledge to use them effectively. But Kemper's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. During Clara's time in Lancaster County, living with her aunt between 1824 and 1827, there had been a series of unexplained deaths among children in the county poorhouse. 7 children had died over a 3-year period, all of ailments that mystified the local physician. The deaths had been attributed to an outbreak of unknown illness, possibly consumption or a novel fever. The Lancaster County poorhouse records showed that Clara Marsh had volunteered there regularly, helping to care for sick and orphaned children. 7 dead children in Lancaster County. 17 dead children in Stillwater Bend. The bodies pulled from the river represented only Clara's crimes in one location. The true number of her victims might exceed 2 dozen. As Kemper's findings became known, resistance to the investigation began to manifest. It came not from defenders of Clara herself. Her guilt was too evident for that, but from individuals and institutions who feared the exposure of their own complicity. Martin Ashford, the county poorhouse overseer, initially refused to provide complete records of child placements. When pressed, he claimed that many documents had been lost or damaged. Prosecutor Blackwell suspected, though could never prove, that Ashford had destroyed records that would reveal just how negligent the oversight of foster placements had been. The county commissioners expressed concern about the reputational damage that extensive publicity might cause. In a letter to Blackwell, Commissioner Harold Finch wrote, "While we support the pursuit of justice, we question whether exhaustive investigation serves any purpose beyond sensationalism. Mrs. Winslow's guilt is established. Perhaps it would be prudent to proceed to trial without further excavation of details that reflect poorly on county administration." Blackwell's response was acidic. If county administration enabled the murder of children through negligence and inadequate oversight, then such reflection is not only appropriate but necessary. The resistance became more direct when Kemper attempted to investigate Clara's time in Lancaster County. The poorhouse director there, a man named Samuel Faust, refused to grant access to records without a court order. When Kemper obtained such an order, he arrived to find that a fire had accidentally destroyed a portion of the poorhouse archives, including the period from 1824 to 1827. Faust expressed deep regret over the unfortunate timing. Kemper reported to Blackwell that the fire had been deliberately set. Witnesses reported seeing Faust burning documents in a barrel behind the poorhouse the night before Kemper's scheduled visit. But proving arson after the fact was nearly impossible, and Faust maintained that he had simply been burning routine waste paper. The message was clear. Institutions that had failed to protect children did not want those failures examined too closely. Threats to the investigators came from less official sources. Dr. Harrow, who had been assisting Blackwell with medical evidence and historical testimony, received an anonymous letter warning him to leave the past buried with the bones. Constable Mercer found his cooperage business boycotted by several longtime customers who claimed they wanted nothing to do with the scandal. More seriously, Kemper was assaulted one evening while walking from his boarding house to the courthouse in Kittanning. 3 men beat him severely, leaving him with a broken arm and cracked ribs. His attackers said nothing during the assault, and Kemper could not identify them. But the attack came 2 days after he had issued subpoenas to several prominent Lancaster County officials. Blackwell requested protection from the state militia, but his request was denied. The official reason was lack of resources. The unstated reason, whispered in political circles, was that powerful interests wanted the investigation contained, not expanded. These were not people defending Clara Winslow. They were people defending themselves, defending reputations, defending institutions, defending a social order that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Despite the resistance, Kemper persisted in tracing Clara's methods and potential connections to other cases. His research led him to a disturbing discovery. Clara's methodology was not unique. In 1847, a woman named Lydia Sherman had been investigated in New Brunswick, New Jersey, for the suspicious deaths of multiple children in her care. The case had been quietly dropped due to insufficient evidence, and Sherman had relocated to New York. In 1849, a widow in Ohio named Sarah Whiteling had been suspected, but never charged, in connection with the deaths of 3 stepchildren who had drowned under questionable circumstances. These cases had not been connected because they occurred in different states, were handled by different authorities, and took place in an era before any systematic sharing of criminal information between jurisdictions. But the patterns were strikingly similar. Widows who took in children, who experienced high mortality rates among those children, who used methods that mimicked natural deaths. Kemper hypothesized that there might be dozens of such cases scattered across the country, each isolated and unreported, each hidden by the same factors that had protected Clara: administrative chaos, high baseline child mortality, and the presumption of maternal virtue. He also discovered something that suggested a darker possibility. Clara might have had direct knowledge of at least one other case. In 1831, a woman named Eliza Anderson had been tried and hanged in Philadelphia for poisoning her 3 children and her husband. The case had been sensational in the Philadelphia newspapers, with detailed descriptions of her methods, including the use of white snake root and the slow administration of botanical poisons to mimic fever. Clara had been living in Lancaster County at the time, less than 70 miles from Philadelphia. Later, while working for Dr. Blake in Pittsburgh, she had asked him specifically about the Anderson case, claiming she was curious about how a woman could have acquired such knowledge of poisons. Blake, flattered by her interest in his field, had provided detailed explanations. The possibility that Clara had studied the methods of a previous murderer, that she had deliberately sought out knowledge from a medical professional to improve her own techniques, suggested a level of premeditation that was chilling. This was not a woman who had fallen into evil through circumstance or passion. This was someone who had methodically prepared herself to kill, who had studied previous cases, who had apprenticed herself to the art of undetectable murder. The question of Clara's husbands became increasingly significant as the investigation deepened. Had any of them known what she was? Had any of them been complicit? Thomas Winslow appeared to have been genuinely ignorant. He had died of pneumonia before Clara's pattern of child murder had fully established itself. Friends and family described him as a simple, honest man who had been charmed by Clara's apparent piety. But William Fletcher and Henry Calloway presented more complex questions. Investigators searched for any evidence that Fletcher might have been aware of Clara's crimes. They found none. But they did discover that Fletcher's frequent business trips, 4 to 6 days away from home each month, had provided Clara with unsupervised time to dispose of children. Whether Fletcher had deliberately arranged his schedule to facilitate her crimes, or whether Clara had simply exploited his natural absences, could not be determined. Fletcher's sister, interviewed by Kemper, offered this observation. William was not a complicated man. He wanted a wife who would manage his household and not trouble him with difficulties. If Clara said a child had run away or fallen ill, he would have accepted that without question. He would not have investigated. He would not have wanted to know details. I think perhaps he chose ignorance even if he did not choose evil. Henry Calloway's case was more troubling. Samuel Ricketts, the dock worker, had witnessed Calloway disposing of what was almost certainly a weighted body in the river. That suggested Calloway had not merely been ignorant, but actively participated in disposing of at least one victim. But Calloway was dead, poisoned by Clara herself, and could not defend himself or explain his actions. Had Clara coerced him into helping dispose of bodies, perhaps through blackmail or threats, had he been a willing accomplice? Or had he, like Fletcher, simply chosen not to look too closely at what was happening in his own household? The only person who knew the truth was Clara, and she refused to discuss her husbands beyond her initial admission that she had killed at least 2 of them. One additional discovery emerged that added a final layer of horror to the case. While searching Clara's home more thoroughly, investigators found a loose stone in the cellar wall. Behind it was a small metal box containing approximately $240 in various coins and bills, a substantial sum for the time. This was money Clara had saved from the quarterly stipends paid by the county for each child in her care. $3 per child per quarter for children who rarely survived more than a year in her household. She had collected the payments, killed the children, and saved the money. The murders had not been crimes of passion or madness. They had been profitable. Clara had run her household as a business, with orphans as inventory to be liquidated once they had generated their value in county payments. This revelation transformed public perception of the crimes. It was one thing to imagine a woman driven to murder by some unknowable psychological compulsion. It was another to confront the fact that she had killed children for approximately $12 per victim, that she had calculated the profit margin of murder and found it acceptable. The residents of Stillwater Bend, already horrified, found themselves facing a truth even darker than they had imagined. Evil did not require grand motives or elaborate justifications. Sometimes it required only cold arithmetic and the absence of conscience. By late May of 1852, Prosecutor Blackwell had assembled a case that he believed was overwhelming. But he had also encountered the limits of what the investigation could accomplish. Records had been destroyed, witnesses had been intimidated, institutional resistance had blocked certain avenues of inquiry. The full scope of Clara's crimes would never be completely known. The 17 names in her ledger would stand as the official count. The bodies in the river would serve as physical evidence. The testimony of Robert Winslow and others would establish her methods and her systematic approach. It would have to be enough to ensure justice, or at least the approximation of justice that the legal system could provide. The trial was scheduled for June of 1852 in the county courthouse at Kittanning. Clara Winslow would face 17 counts of murder. The penalty, if convicted, was death by hanging. But even as Blackwell prepared his prosecution, he understood that some questions would remain forever unanswered. How many children had truly died by Clara's hand? Had anyone else knowingly assisted her? What had made her into what she was, nature, experience, or something else entirely? The law could punish Clara Winslow, but it could not explain her. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing realization of all. That evil of this magnitude could exist without adequate explanation, could emerge from circumstances that seemed ordinary, could hide behind piety and respectability for nearly 2 decades before chance and circumstance finally exposed it. The river had kept Clara's secrets for 17 years. Now those secrets would be brought into the light of a courtroom, examined and documented and judged. But the deepest secret, the question of what created Clara Winslow, would remain hidden, buried somewhere beneath the surface where no investigation could reach. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the ledger, the burial shrouds, the cold arithmetic of murder for profit, the investigation continues to peel back layers that somehow make this even darker. And we still haven't reached the trial, the moment when Clara Winslow would finally face public judgment for what she had done. I need you to share this video right now. Not tomorrow, not after you finish watching. Right now. Here's why: YouTube's algorithm is already suppressing this content. The view count you see is likely lower than the actual number of people who have watched. The platform doesn't want content this disturbing to spread organically. They want safe, advertiser-friendly material. But this story needs to be told. Stories like this were sealed for 100 years specifically to prevent people from understanding how predators operate, how they exploit trust and institutional chaos, and how they hide in plain sight for decades. You are part of a true crime family that refuses to look away from difficult truths. Every share, every comment, every engagement tells the algorithm that this matters more than comfort. You're not just watching a video, you're participating in recovering hidden history. And trust me, what happens in that courtroom, the testimony that emerges during the trial, reveals aspects of Clara Winslow's psychology that are somehow more disturbing than the crimes themselves. Because when she finally spoke in her own defense, what she said changed how everyone understood what they were dealing with. Are you ready to see this through to the end? Then let's enter that courtroom together. The trial of Clara Winslow began on June 14, 1852, in the Allegheny County Courthouse in Kittanning. The building, a modest brick structure with a single courtroom, had never hosted proceedings of this magnitude. By 7 o'clock in the morning, more than 300 people had gathered outside, though the courtroom could accommodate fewer than 100 spectators. Constable Mercer and 4 deputized men maintained order as the crowd pressed against the doors. Judge Thaddeus Moorfield presided. He was 63 years old, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, known for his stern demeanor and strict interpretation of the law. He had reviewed the preliminary evidence and understood that this case would test not only the legal system, but the community's ability to confront the incomprehensible. Clara was led into the courtroom in irons, wearing a plain gray dress that witnesses described as severe but clean. Her appearance had changed noticeably during her 2 months of confinement. She had lost weight, and her hair, which she had always worn in a tight bun, hung loose around her shoulders. But her expression remained what it had been since her arrest, unnervingly calm, absent of visible emotion. She had refused legal counsel multiple times. Judge Moorfield had appointed an attorney named Benjamin Watts to represent her, but Clara would not cooperate with him. Watts, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment, informed the court that his client refused to mount a defense and would not permit him to call witnesses on her behalf. Prosecutor Blackwell's case was methodical and devastating. Over 3 days, he presented 47 witnesses and 112 pieces of physical evidence. Dr. Harrow testified about the 11 bodies recovered from the river, describing in clinical detail the identical manner of wrapping, the consistent use of river stones as weights, and the calculated selection of disposal locations. He presented comparative analysis showing that the fabric remnants from the river remains matched the burial shrouds found in Clara's cellar. Robert Winslow gave testimony that lasted nearly 4 hours. He described in halting, pain-filled words what he had witnessed as a 7-year-old child. Clara sedating his stepsister Margaret, wrapping her living body in weighted cloth, carrying her to the river. He recounted 17 years of living with that secret, of watching other children enter Clara's household and disappear, of being too terrified to speak. Several times during his testimony, Robert broke down completely. Judge Moorfield called recesses to allow him to compose himself. Clara watched her stepson testify without visible reaction, her face as expressionless as carved stone. The ledger was entered as evidence and read aloud in its entirety. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Blackwell recited 17 names, 17 dates, 17 notations about river stones and disposal locations. When he reached the final entry, Daniel Morse, age 9 years. October 3, 1851, river stones, 7 count, below ferry crossing night, struggled. Several women in the gallery wept openly. Martin Ashford testified about the children he had placed in Clara's care, his voice barely above a whisper. He identified 7 of the names in the ledger as children from the county poorhouse. Under cross-examination by Blackwell, who treated Ashford more as a hostile witness than a neutral party, the poorhouse overseer admitted that he had never conducted follow-up visits to foster placements, had never required regular reports on children's welfare, had maintained records so poorly that children could disappear without triggering any systematic investigation. "How many children did you place in total, Mr. Ashford, during your tenure as overseer?" Blackwell asked. I don't have exact figures available. You don't know how many children passed through your care. The records are incomplete. The records are incomplete because you kept them incompletely. Is that correct? I did the best I could with limited resources. Did your best include ever visiting even one child after placement? Did it include maintaining a registry that would allow you to track outcomes? Did it include any systematic oversight whatsoever? Ashford had no adequate answer. His testimony exposed not only his personal failures, but the systemic negligence that had enabled Clara to operate undetected. The county poorhouse system, designed to protect the most vulnerable children, had instead delivered them into a predator's hands. Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard testified about seeing Clara dispose of a weighted bundle in the river in 1847. Samuel Ricketts described witnessing Henry Calloway dumping what he now understood to have been a child's body. Both witnesses were overcome with guilt, their testimonies punctuated by apologies and expressions of self-recrimination. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that Benjamin Watts, Clara's appointed attorney, made no meaningful attempt to challenge it. During cross-examination, he asked only perfunctory questions, clearly going through the motions of representation without belief in any possible defense. On the 4th day of the trial, Judge Moorfield asked Clara directly if she wished to testify on her own behalf. She had the right to remain silent, he explained, but also the right to speak if she chose. Clara rose from her chair. "I will speak." The courtroom, already silent, somehow became even quieter. This would be the first time Clara had spoken publicly since her arrest beyond the brief interview with Justice Goodwin. She was not sworn in. Defendants in that era were not permitted to testify under oath, as they were considered too invested in the outcome to be reliable. But she was permitted to make a statement, which Judge Moorfield warned the jury would not carry the weight of sworn testimony. Clara stood in the dock, her manacled hands clasped in front of her, and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. "I am guilty of everything alleged," she began. "The ledger is accurate. The count is correct. 17 children died by my hand. I do not dispute the facts, but I wish to be understood, and I believe I will not be." Judge Moorfield leaned forward. "Mrs. Winslow, I must caution you that anything you say may be used against you." "There is nothing that can be used against me that has not already been presented," Clara replied. "I am condemned, I know this, I accept it. But before I am executed, I wish to say what no one here wants to hear." She paused, looking directly at the jury for the first time. "You believe I am aberrant, extraordinary, a monster unlike anyone you know. This belief comforts you. It allows you to distance yourselves from what I am. But I tell you this, I am not unique. I am simply the one who was caught. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Moorfield struck his gavel once. Clara continued, her voice never wavering. In every county, in every town, there are children no one values. Orphans, foundlings, the poorhouse refused. You place them with strangers for $3 per quarter and never ask what becomes of them. You lose track of them, forget their names, assume they are somewhere being cared for by someone. You allow this because their lives are inconvenient, their deaths unmemorable. I provided a service, I removed burdens. The county was grateful. Mr. Ashford said as much when he placed each child with me. Grateful that someone would take them, would accept the responsibility. I accepted that responsibility and discharged it in the manner I found most efficient. Blackwell rose to object, but Judge Moorfield waved him down. Let her speak. You call me evil, Clara said, but evil requires intent to violate moral law. I felt no such violation because I recognized no such law. The children I killed were unwanted. If they had been wanted, they would not have been available to me. Society had already condemned them to forgettability. I simply hastened the inevitable. You are horrified now because the river revealed what it should have kept hidden. But nothing I did was unknown to you in principle. You knew children in poorhouse placement often died. You knew the tracking was inadequate. You knew, and you chose not to look closely because looking closely would require resources, effort, care. It was easier to assume all was well. Easier to praise the godly widow who took in the unwanted. Easier to attend memorial services than to audit placements. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person transfixed by Clara's cold articulation of truths that implicated not just herself but the entire social system. When you hang me, Clara concluded, you will tell yourselves that justice has been served, that the monster has been eliminated, that such horrors cannot happen again. But I tell you, there are others like me, in counties across this nation, disposing of the children you don't want to count. The only difference is that the river has not yet given up their secrets. She sat down. The silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds before Judge Moorfield found his voice. The defendant has concluded her statement. Mr. Blackwell, do you wish to respond? Blackwell stood, his face pale. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. I have nothing to add to the evidence already presented. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 17 counts of murder. Judge Moorfield sentenced Clara Winslow to death by hanging, the execution to be carried out within 30 days. He delivered the sentence in a voice that betrayed unusual emotion for a man known for judicial restraint. You have committed acts of such calculated evil that this court struggles to comprehend their scope. You have murdered children placed in your trust, betrayed every principle of maternal care, and shown no remorse for your actions. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Clara received the sentence without visible reaction. The execution was scheduled for July 18, 1852, in the yard behind the Kittanning courthouse. Hangings were typically public spectacles in that era, but Judge Moorfield ordered this one closed to all but essential witnesses and a small group of officials. He stated that he would not allow Clara's death to become entertainment. Approximately 30 people attended, including Prosecutor Blackwell, Dr. Harrow, Constable Mercer, Judge Moorfield, the hangman, and several county officials. Also present was Reverend Samuel Pitched, who had insisted on attending to offer Clara spiritual counsel, though she had refused to meet with him in the days before the execution. Clara was brought to the gallows at 8 o'clock in the morning. She wore the same gray dress she had worn at trial. When asked if she had any final words, she shook her head. The hangman placed the noose around her neck. The hood was lowered over her face. At 8:17 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Contemporary accounts indicate that Clara Winslow died quickly with minimal suffering. Her body was left hanging for 20 minutes, as was customary, then cut down and placed in an unmarked grave in the potter's field adjacent to the county cemetery. No stone marks her burial place. The exact location was deliberately left unrecorded to prevent the site from becoming a macabre curiosity. But the execution of Clara Winslow did not bring the reckoning to a close. In many ways, it only began. The county officials who had enabled her crimes through negligence and incompetence faced no legal consequences. Martin Ashford resigned his position as poorhouse overseer, but was never charged with any crime. The county commissioners who had resisted the investigation remained in office. Samuel Faust, the Lancaster County poorhouse director who had almost certainly destroyed records to hide his own negligence, suffered no punishment. Justice, it seemed, was reserved for the murderer herself, but not for those whose systematic failures had made her crimes possible. This disparity did not go unnoticed. In the weeks following Clara's execution, several Pennsylvania newspapers published editorials demanding reform of the poorhouse and foster placement systems. The Pittsburgh Gazette ran a scathing piece titled, "How Many More Clara Winslows?" that called for mandatory oversight, regular inspections, and criminal penalties for officials who failed to protect children in their care. Some reforms did emerge. The Pennsylvania legislature passed the Child Placement Accountability Act of 1853, which required quarterly inspections of all foster placements, mandated detailed record-keeping, and established penalties for officials who failed to maintain adequate documentation. County poorhouses were required to conduct annual audits of all placed children and account for their welfare or whereabouts, but these reforms were inconsistently enforced. Rural counties lacked the resources or will to implement them fully. Within a decade, many of the requirements had been quietly abandoned or reduced to meaningless paperwork exercises. The deeper reforms, the ones that would have required society to fundamentally value the lives of orphaned and abandoned children, to invest resources in their protection, to hold institutions and individuals accountable for their welfare. Those reforms never materialized. Clara Winslow had been right about one thing: society's willingness to forget was stronger than its commitment to justice. Of the few survivors of Clara's household, most carried scars that never healed. Robert Winslow, after testifying at the trial, left Pennsylvania and was never heard from again. Researchers who later investigated the case found no trace of him after 1852. It's possible he changed his name, sought anonymity, and tried to escape the trauma of his childhood. Or perhaps, as some have speculated, the weight of 17 years of enforced silence and survivor's guilt became unbearable. The child who had survived scarlet fever while in Clara's care, a girl whose name was lost to incomplete records, was located by investigators but could provide no useful testimony. She had been only 4 years old at the time and remembered nothing of Clara or the household. Others who had encountered Clara and survived, children who had been briefly in her care before being reclaimed by relatives or moved to other placements, were scattered across multiple states by the time of the trial. Most were never located or interviewed. The question of how many children had truly died at Clara's hands remained unanswered. 17 was the confirmed count from her ledger. 7 more possible victims in Lancaster County. 4 unidentified bodies from the river. Possibly others whose bodies had drifted downstream and were never found, or who had been disposed of by other means, or who had died during the unrecorded years before Clara's ledger began. The true number could have been 25, it could have been 30, it could have been more. The river, as Clara said, knew the truth, but the river kept its secrets. In the years immediately following the trial, Stillwater Bend struggled with its legacy. The town's population declined as families moved away, unwilling to raise children in a place marked by such horror. The Methodist Episcopal Church, where Clara had attended services so faithfully, saw attendance drop dramatically. Reverend Pitcht resigned his position in 1853, moved to Ohio, and never preached again. The house on River Street where Clara had lived and killed stood empty for years. No one would purchase it despite the low price. In 1860, it burned under mysterious circumstances, likely arson by someone who wanted the physical reminder of Clara's crimes erased. The trial records were sealed by court order in 1853, officially to protect the privacy of surviving family members and witnesses. They remained sealed for 100 years, as specified in Judge Moorfield's order. When the records were finally opened in 1953, researchers who examined them were struck by how thoroughly the case had been forgotten. Local histories of Stillwater Bend from the late 1800s made no mention of Clara Winslow. County records that should have referenced the trial had been removed or misfiled. The case had been deliberately erased from public memory, buried as deeply as Clara's victims had been buried in the river. This erasure was intentional. Communities wanted to forget. Officials wanted to avoid accountability. And in an era before mass media and national crime databases, forgetting was easy. But forgetting ensured that the patterns Clara exploited, institutional negligence, social indifference to vulnerable children, the assumption that respectable appearances equated to moral character, those patterns persisted, creating conditions for other predators to operate in other communities. Clara Winslow was caught because of accident and chance. A dredging project in a specific location, the random entanglement of burial shrouds that had remained intact for 17 years. Without that accident, she might have continued indefinitely or simply moved to another town when the supply of available children in Stillwater Bend diminished. How many others like her were never caught? How many operated in counties where no dredging project disturbed the river bottom, where no chance discovery forced authorities to confront the unthinkable? These questions haunted Prosecutor Blackwell for the rest of his life. In his private journal, discovered after his death in 1871, he wrote, "I secured a conviction and witnessed justice served, yet I cannot escape the certainty that Clara Winslow was not singular. She was simply careless enough or unlucky enough to be discovered. The true horror is not what she did, but what she represents. A systematic exploitation of vulnerability that continues because we choose not to see it. The widow who fed her children to the river was dead. But the river that had enabled her crimes flowed on, indifferent and eternal, carrying water and secrets toward an ocean that would never give them up." The case of Clara Winslow forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how evil operates in plain sight, and more disturbingly, how societies enable that evil through institutional negligence and willful blindness. Clara herself was undoubtedly a psychopath in the clinical sense, someone fundamentally incapable of empathy, who viewed other human beings as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. But psychopathy alone does not explain 17 years of successful predation. Clara's crimes were enabled by a perfect storm of social factors that rendered vulnerable children essentially invisible. The mid-19th century poorhouse system created a population of children who existed in administrative limbo. They were documented just enough to be placed with foster families, but not enough to be protected or tracked. They had no advocates, no relatives checking on their welfare, no systematic oversight. They were, in Clara's chilling phrase, unwanted, and their unwanted status made them perfect victims. What's most disturbing is that this vulnerability was not accidental, it was structural. The system was designed for efficiency and cost savings, not child welfare. County officials were incentivized to place children quickly and cheaply, not to ensure their safety. Foster families received minimal compensation and no training or supervision. The entire apparatus functioned on the assumption that most placements would work out adequately, and that the occasional tragedy was simply the cost of doing business. Clara understood this system better than anyone. She recognized that a child who disappeared from her household would trigger a perfunctory inquiry at best, that explanations of drowning or fever or running away would be accepted without investigation, that her status as a respectable church-going widow provided immunity from serious suspicion. She weaponized society's indifference. The question that haunted investigators and continues to haunt researchers who study the case is this: how many other Clara Winslows existed in that era? The statistical likelihood is that she was not unique. The conditions that enabled her, administrative chaos, high baseline child mortality, vulnerable populations of orphans, cultural assumptions about maternal virtue, existed across the entire nation. There were thousands of counties, tens of thousands of poorhouse placements, countless opportunities for predators to exploit the same vulnerabilities Clara exploited. We will never know how many others operated successfully and died without their crimes being discovered. We can only acknowledge the probability that Clara's case represents not an aberration, but a pattern that was rarely exposed. The lessons that should have been learned from the Winslow case were not learned, or were learned only temporarily and superficially. Child welfare systems improved marginally, but remained fundamentally vulnerable to the same exploitation. Throughout the late 1800s and into the 20th century, cases continued to emerge of foster parents and institutional caregivers who abused, neglected, or killed children in their care. The modern era has not eliminated these vulnerabilities. Foster care systems still struggle with inadequate oversight, overworked caseworkers, and children who fall through bureaucratic cracks. Residential institutions for children still occasionally produce scandals of systematic abuse that went undetected for years. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying pattern persists. Vulnerable populations, inadequate oversight, and predators who understand how to exploit both. Clara Winslow's story was sealed and buried for 100 years not merely to protect the privacy of survivors, but because it revealed truths that communities and institutions did not want to confront. It exposed not just individual evil but systemic failure. It forced people to acknowledge that the respectable surface of society could hide monstrous depths, that the institutions designed to protect the vulnerable could become mechanisms of their destruction. Perhaps most uncomfortably, it revealed that ordinary people, neighbors, doctors, officials, clergy, could witness warning signs and do nothing, could accept comfortable explanations rather than pursue disturbing questions, and could prioritize social cohesion over the safety of children. The widow who fed her children to the river was a monster. But she was a monster that society created room for, that institutional negligence enabled, that cultural assumptions protected. Her execution removed her from the world. It did not remove the conditions that had allowed her to kill 17 children over 17 years. And that, ultimately, is why her story matters. Not as a tale of singular evil, but as a case study in how systems fail, how societies choose blindness over vigilance, and how the most vulnerable among us remain vulnerable because protecting them requires resources, attention, and a commitment to value lives that society finds it easier to forget. The river gave up Clara's secrets in 1852, but the deeper currents that enabled her crimes continue to flow, carrying other secrets, other failures, other children whose names we will never know. The question is not whether we are shocked by what Clara Winslow did. The question is whether we are willing to examine the structures that made her crimes possible, and whether we have the courage to confront similar structures that exist today. History suggests we are not, that we will react with appropriate horror, demand temporary reforms, and then gradually return to comfortable assumptions and convenient neglect. The river knows, and it still keeps secrets. So here's the question I want you to wrestle with, the one that kept investigators awake at night and still troubles researchers who study this case. What do you think really happened? Not just the mechanics of Clara's crimes, we know those from her ledger and the evidence. The deeper question, how many children truly died? Was 17 the real number, or was it 25, 30, even more? How many bodies drifted downstream and dissolved into the river silt, never to be counted? How many other Clara Winslows operated in other towns, along other rivers, disposing of unwanted children with the same methodical precision? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many people knew or suspected and chose silence over action? How many warning signs were dismissed because confronting them would have been uncomfortable, would have disrupted social order, would have required difficult questions about systems everyone preferred to trust? Comment below with your thoughts, not just about Clara, but about the broader implications, because this story isn't really about one woman in one town in 1852. It's about how societies create conditions for predators to thrive, how institutional negligence becomes complicity, how the most vulnerable among us remain vulnerable because protecting them is inconvenient. If you've made it this far, you're part of a community that refuses to look away from difficult truths. That's rare. Most people want comfortable narratives with clear heroes and villains. You've chosen to sit with complexity, to confront the reality that evil often wears a respectable face and operates with society's unconscious cooperation. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Click the notification bell for all notifications. These videos get suppressed, and subscribing without notifications means you'll miss most of what I post. Next week, I'm covering a case from 1847 Massachusetts that makes Clara Winslow look almost merciful by comparison. The Schoolmaster's Collection, How a Respected Teacher Preserved His Victims. It involves a discovery made during the renovation of a schoolhouse that revealed a 15-year pattern of disappearances that no one had connected until they found what was hidden in the walls. It's going to test your limits, but I know you're ready for it because you made it through this one. Thank you for your bravery in listening to this story. Thank you for not turning away when it became uncomfortable. Thank you for understanding that knowing history's darkest chapters is not morbid curiosity, it's necessary vigilance. The widow who fed her children to the river has been dead for over 170 years. But the patterns she exploited, the vulnerabilities she understood, the institutional failures that enabled her, those haven't been buried nearly as deeply as her victims. The river still flows through Stillwater Bend, Pennsylvania. The town itself has largely disappeared, absorbed into larger municipalities, its original buildings gone, its history forgotten by most. But the river remains, carrying water from the mountains to the sea, indifferent to what rests in the silt beneath its surface. Somewhere in that silt there may still be bones, small bones wrapped in rotted fabric, scattered by 170 years of current and flood. Bones that were never found during the 1852 dredging, never identified, never counted in the official tally. Children whose names Clara never recorded, or recorded in documents never discovered. Children who exist now only as possibilities, as statistical probabilities, as ghosts in the gaps between what was known and what was hidden. The river knows their names, and it keeps them still.